Hi, I'm Rob Linhart,
I'm Lily Margolis.
and welcome to Flight School, Austrian edition. So yeah, Lily, today we're going to be talking about Austrian wines. Have you had any wines from Austria? Have you had many?
I am a big fan of Gruner Veltliner.
All right.
That's pretty much my only experience with Austrian wine.
Pretty much it. All right. And Gruner Veltliner, white grape that pretty much everybody knows. And I'm super excited about this because we're going to be tasting Berger Gruner Veltliner. And this was my first exposure to any Austrian wine, and certainly Gruner Veltliner in particular. It's been a long time since I've gotten to taste this wine. I'm really looking forward to it. General impressions of Gruner from past experience.
Ooh, very bright, easy drinker. I usually end up drinking it with pizza or oysters. Definitely a summertime favorite of mine.
Summertime favorite, nice. Some key takeaways here with Gruner Veltliner. It is probably the most widely grown white grape in Austria. Riesling might give it a run for its money, but you're going to find this stuff everywhere, all over Austria. They grow it at all levels, and I'm really excited to try this one out. You'll see this is a liter bottle with a screw cap. That's how the Austrians roll. I would consider this a session wine. Let's get going.
Okay.
Yeah. First impressions?
Lots of lime zest.
Lots of lime. I agree. Green apple, a little bit of something almost like white cherry. And I would say on the nose for me, a classic marker for Gruner Veltliner, something just a little bit green, almost like green beans or canned peas, something like that. Just a little bit of that laying on top of this wine. Absolutely classic. Something as professional as we look at as a marker for Gruner Veltliner. Good minerality here. It's getting a little salty on the finish as well. I quite like it. How do you feel about the structure of the wine?
Structurally, definitely you notice a little of the minerality, especially after the wine is off your palate. On the palate, very solid, not too overwhelming though. I would say medium body. This is definitely just a style of wine that I enjoy, so I have nothing bad to say about
Super
this.
easy drinking,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And really good acidity. And that acidity and what we're talking, that minerality and some very nice depth of fruit here that make these wines really food friendly. And super versatile. Yeah, the acidity in particular on this wine is really kind of jumping out at me. So almost Riesling-like. Does make a good substitute sometimes for Riesling if you're afraid of Riesling. We're going to be talking about that later. So I sort of referenced this as kind of a session wine, if you will, and you can see a liter bottle and with that screw cap on there. Once you get that thing open, you're going to be drinking it, I'm sure. Always drink responsibly, but it goes down easy. Yeah, and again, it will pair with so many foods at your table.
Yeah, definitely a good wine for a dinner party, especially with the full liter size.
Yeah. So Gruner Veltliner can come at some very, very high ends. It can be made at a very high level. It can be very expensive, but typically really good value for a great white wine. Yeah.
One last question about Gruner Veltliner. Is there a specific region? Does this have any regional distinctions of where and where it cannot be grown, such as Champagne, for example?
I would say not specifically, but the best examples do tend to come from the Wachau region, and areas and valleys along the Rhine are really where we sort of see the best examples come from, the classiest examples. But as far as I know, there's no prohibition against growing it anywhere in Austria, and I'm quite sure they do. All right, let's go. Moving on now. So I'm going to let you tell me what you think this might be.
Oh no.
It's another white
This is my,
from Austria.
This is my first
A
ever.
little less common for the record, but we're going to see what Lily has to say.
High acid again, some green apple, but also some subtle like caramely, slightly sweeter vanilla-y notes, but it's in there. It's a very layered.
Kind of hiding in there. For me, one of the dominant notes in this wine, it's very grassy, very herbaceous. And we are talking about Weingut Schauer Sauvignon Blanc. Yes, they do grow Sauvignon Blanc in Austria, and here, mostly in the warmer regions when we get down into the south and the eastern parts of the country. And this is a particularly good example, again, with some great minerality. Not as citrusy as you might think, and I noticed you didn't really have too much to say about that, but this grassy herbal element in this wine, I do tend to see that in these Austrian Sauvignon Blancs, and by the way, I tend to find it a bit in Northern Italian Sauvignon Blancs too. Maybe one of these days we'll get to taste one of those. But overall impressions, what do you think of the wine?
I really liked it. This is my kind of wine. Like, it's fruit forward, it's light, it's easy to drink.
Yeah.
There's a good texture to it, but it's not too overwhelming. This definitely is just my kind of thing.
Nice. So, and that's partly why I chose it, just to illustrate that most of these countries, Austria, known for its Gruner Veltliner, that is maybe, again, the dominant grape, but not the only one, and they're growing some great stuff. The universality, the ability of Sauvignon Blanc to be grown so well in so many places, the Austrians doing a real good job where they're growing this, yeah?
What are some key differences between domestic and Old World Sauvignon Blanc?
Good question. I think by and large, one of the main differences is the minerality of the wine. So often we get that from Sancerre, for example, in France, the reference point for Sauvignon Blanc, really. But the Austrian Sauvignon Blancs tend to bring that as well. Where it's grown in the US, sometimes we'll get that minerality, but they tend to be a little bit rounder acid, and a little fuller bodied. And the domestic Sauvignon Blanc, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here, tends to lean a little more towards stone fruits, peach and apricot, and sometimes they get kind of tropical. Lemon would be a note if we were going to go into a citrusy place. Again, I think minerality is really something that tends to show more commonly with European Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Like, I have noticed the peach, the apricot when we were tasting domestic Sauvignon Blanc on a separate episode of Flight School. Yeah. And I wouldn't have guessed blind tasting that this was Sauvignon Blanc, partly because of my lack of experience, but also because I haven't tasted as many foreign Sauvignon Blancs and would have expected those stone fruit flavors.
Right. So it's not impossible that those could show up in a wine like this. But again, we're painting with a broad brush here. But yeah, I think if I had to pick one thing, I would say we see more minerality overtly in the European versions. We've got a red for you.
Nice.
A classic Austrian red grape. This is Zweigelt, also from Berger. Now this grape is grown in other parts of the world, but only in really small amounts. When we think Zweigelt, we pretty much think Austria. That is classic. So I'm going to ask you what you think.
I really like it.
What stands out for you?
Well, first of all, I'm not getting like a ton of acidity or a ton of tannins either way. It seems to be a very, like, not smooth drinking wine. There's not like a ton of texture for me. And then I really also noticed that a strawberry flavor in this for me, like very sun-warmed strawberries. Like, I picked it from the garden, and you're kind of, you can kind of taste the plants around them too when you're eating that. So
right. Yeah, super fresh and peppery, spicy. And that is definitely a marker for Zweigelt, that great spice. So sometimes we pitch these wines for those kinds of dishes. Also, I would say fairly light. And the classic red grapes of Austria, including Zweigelt, can surprise you. Now, would you think this was a sweet wine or a dry wine?
I would say
it's not a trick question. Feels sweet, yeah. Right? Now, my guess is that's the freshness of the fruit, and I agree with you. I actually thought I picked up maybe just a sense of sweetness, but probably in terms of sugar levels, this is actually a pretty dry wine, and I'm guessing it's also very low alcohol. I would be surprised if this wine gets anywhere over about 12.5%, maybe 13% alcohol, and we're going to go ahead and look and see if we can find it on here real quick. 12.5% alcohol, right?
Right on. That makes a lot of sense, too, with like my interpretation of the wine, because I didn't feel like I was getting punched by the content or anything like that.
Right.
And sometimes that can be overwhelming for me.
Right. So that's a good, important key takeaway, by the way. The classic Austrian reds, Zweigelt included, and there are others, those grapes tend to get fully ripe with fairly low sugar levels, and that means they can be fully dry at fairly low alcohol levels. So for those of you who are looking for dry red wines that you want in a lighter style and you want lower alcohol, Austria is always a go-to for us when we make these recommendations, because typically you'll find these wines fully dry at 12.5%, sometimes even less. So great options for those of you who are looking for good food-friendly reds, but also want a lower alcohol situation without having some sort of alcohol remove thing going on.
And can you define sweet and dry wine?
Sure. Sweet wine has noticeable amounts of sugar in it. A dry wine doesn't. Now, there are technical rules for that, and they can vary from country to country and from category to category. But for most human beings, the threshold of detection for sugar on your tongue, on your palate, is somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, 8 to 10 grams per liter of sugar, somewhere in that range, and it'll vary from person to person. Some are a little more sensitive, some are a little less. But basically, when we think of a dry wine, we're thinking of a wine that we're not really noticing sugar on our palate. And after that, we can get into sweet wines. Off-dry wines would be somewhere in the middle. Off-dry, semi-sweet, basically the same thing. So we need to be careful sometimes, because this wine is actually going to be considered fairly dry, but it gives a sense of sweetness, right?
Yeah.
It tricks us like that
Yeah,
sometimes.
I definitely felt a little tricked by this one.
And that's the freshness in the fruit. So that's something sometimes we have to talk about with customers, to don't let the smell of the wine fool you into thinking that the wine's going to be sweet.
Yeah, so the sugar content doesn't always directly correlate what you're going to get on the nose.
Nope. So many impressions, and the nose is what the nose is. And it's like, to give that the best example, and you gave it, you smelled these super fresh, sweet strawberries, and you kind of tasted that a little bit. I smelled those super sweet, fresh strawberries, but I didn't really get too much of a sense of sweetness. So some of that is just where our palates are at, and some of that is where our heads are at. So that's going to wrap it up. Just a quick dipping our toes in the water of Austrian wine here, and we'll probably revisit this down the road a little bit. We'll take a deeper dive. Any final thoughts?
Excited to keep exploring Austria.
All right, so am I.
Excited for some more Gruner Veltliner for the end of the summer.
Nice. We're going to start to get, we're going to get serious with the Gruner down the line. Just you wait.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. That's going to do it for this episode. Big thanks to Luke Bishop and Maverick Beverage Company for providing the wines and their expertise today.
Thanks for flying with us today. Subscribe to Hazel's Beverage World on YouTube and ask your questions in the comments.